Okay, I guess let's go ahead and begin the meeting, the expert dialogue. So, hello everyone. Thank you for joining from all around the world. Happy good morning or good evening or good afternoon or whatever time it is, wherever you are. This is the expert dialogue on making OECMs work, landscape approaches for effective biodiversity conservation. My name is William Dunbar. I'm with Conservation International in the Japan office. I'm a project manager for international landscapes and seascape policy. I'd like to quickly go through, thank my co-organizers along with Conservation International, which are United Nations University Institute for the Advanced Study of Sustainability and UNDP. And also many thanks to our cooperating organizations, the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, IUCN World WCPA, UNCTAD, and UNESCO. Again, thank you all for joining. It looks like we've got a pretty good number of participants, so I think we can just go ahead and I will go ahead and introduce the first presenter today. We're very happy to have Harry Jonas, who's co-chair of the IUCN WCPA Specialist Group on OECMs, to give us an update on OECMs and the OECM process. So I guess, Harry, go ahead.
Great. Hello. Thanks very much, William. Hello, everybody. William, I just want to check that my screen is showing as it should be.
Yeah, I think we can see it perfectly.
Right. Dear friends, it's wonderful to be on this webinar today. My name is Harry Jonas. I'm working at WWF US, and I'm also one of the co-chairs of the IUCN WCPA Specialist Group on OECMs with Kathy McKinnon. And my role is just to provide a short 10-minute overview of this framework, a little bit of the background, some of the nuts and bolts of the framework and where it's going. At the end of the call, I'm going to drop in a whole range of additional links and resources so that you can, as well as, you can continue to search for the information on this. I don't normally start my presentations with the next slide, but what I wanted to say was that I know we're talking about, amongst other things, sepals, and William and colleagues are based in Japan. 2010, Nagoya, Japan, colleagues and I were working, amongst other things, on local indigenous peoples, local communities, traditional knowledge, in particular, ways of life, and also sustainable uses of biodiversity. And at that time, I was wondering to myself, why are these areas not better represented? And when Aichi Biodiversity Target 11 was finally drafted and contained this undefined term, other effective area-based conservation measures, a number of colleagues and I, after considerable engagement with a number of people who I actually see on this call, made this suggestion. We said, look, we have this undefined term in international law. Why don't we retroactively define it to better recognize areas that deliver the conservation of biodiversity outside protected areas? That was the pitch, as it were. And that was, that turned into a task force with an IUCN, which then led to, with lots of other input, the CBD decision in 2018. And so I just wanted to say that because it shows that this isn't for the first time sepals and OECMs trying to work themselves out. It's always been a very, they've been integrally considered all this time. So it's wonderful to see them being further considered, basically. So for me, the top line here is that OECMs, this framework, represents a significant step forward in the recognition of areas that are conserving biodiversity, and particularly also recognition of the governance authorities that are generating these conservation outcomes in areas outside of protected areas. So in 2018, COP14 in Sharm el-Sheikh, parties to the CBD agreed a definition for what is an other effective area-based conservation measure. I'm going to pause and I'll invite you to read the definition on screen. Thank you. So it's wonderfully straightforward, and I have to say the rest of the decision on other effective area-based conservation measures is equally clear. An area, we should know the area we're talking about. It should be geographically defined. The area must be outside of a protected area. An area cannot be a PA and also an OECM. It should be one or the other or something else. There should be governance and management that is whether dedicated to actually creating biodiversity outcomes, it should be achieving those outcomes. It should be achieving, it says here, positive and sustained long-term outcomes for the in-situ conservation of biodiversity. These areas are areas that are delivering, not areas that one day hope to achieve. And importantly, also referenced are ecosystem functions and services and a range of other values, including, as you can see, cultural, spiritual, socioeconomic, amongst other values that are embedded within and given life through those interactions between people and their landscapes, seascapes, or river basins. So the first question generally that comes back then is, well, that sounds great, but actually what's the difference between a PA and an OECM, these two concepts? And the distinction is a simple and I think quite elegant one. A protected area is defined by the CBD and subsequently by IUCN are areas that are dedicated to the conservation of biodiversity. These are areas likely have got some kind of a management plan, and near the top of the management plan will say, these are the biodiversity values that we are intending to conserve, and this is how we're going to do it. Another way to refer to that is that these areas have a primary conservation objective. In slight contrast, to meet the criteria of being an OECM, an area does not have to be dedicated to the conservation of biodiversity. But as I said before, through forms of governance and through forms of management, these areas should be delivering the long-term conservation of biodiversity. And so when you take those two concepts in landscapes and seascapes, we see this great complementarity. These are areas that are dedicated to conservation, wonderful, they should be further supported, but equally now the CBD is clear that these other areas that also exist in the landscapes and seascapes should be also given due credit and support and recognized and reported. OECMs can be governed by all the 4 IUCN governance types, including government agencies, private individuals, as well as private sector entities, very importantly, as well as indigenous peoples and local communities, and of course in shared arrangements. And you can see the importance of this when you look at a map like this. I need to preface this map by saying I am not suggesting that all territories of indigenous peoples, local communities could be or should be OECMs. That's not the point I'm making with this slide, but the point I'm making is that when you look at the green polygons, you see where the protected areas are, and you see how important in this context indigenous peoples' territories are, A, to area-based coverage, B, to connectivity, and as a result, also all the other related values that you'll find in Target 11 and now Draft Target 3. including ecological representativity, ecosystem functions and services, amongst other things. And of course, carbon storage increasingly, focused on in our world as well. So, and leading from that, a part of my work that I've focused on a lot is governance and equity in protected and conserved areas. And this OECM framework really provides a very, very good opportunity to recognize these very diverse forms of governance through rights-based processes occurring around the world that to date have not been as well recognized as they should have been. So this is an opportunity, I believe, to right that. And by doing those things, we can recognize a whole series of, in this context, biodiversity benefits. I won't read all these out or go through them. You can have a quick scan and pick out those things that you may be working on. But the full gamut of biodiversity benefits contributing directly to target 3 of the draft Global Biodiversity Framework, but also many, many other targets as well in their own ways. OECMs are not just, they're referenced in target 3, they contribute to a whole range of different targets and sustainable development goals and issues under the UNFCCC, amongst others. So this is what the current map looks like. In green again, you can see the protected areas all around the world. And what you're seeing as well is OECMs starting to appear on the map. Some of them are currently too small to see, including in the Philippine Seas. And the one your eyes will be drawn to, of course, that's southern Algeria. And that's probably a relatively unique geography. We're not expecting on seeing many OECMs. That's a few OECMs that are conjoined. And that's just simply because the south of Algeria is so such low levels of population that something like that may be possible. So, but you can see already the kind of coverage is coming up, contributing to that overall coverage, and therefore those other values, 1.3 million square kilometers of land, largely contributed to because of Algeria's contribution, but also in the marine context, that contribution coming up as well. However, friends, I'm reaching, William, the end of my presentation. Whilst I have spoken to the opportunities offered by this framework, there are a serious number of challenges, and I really want to underscore that. I'm essentially requesting and asking, you plural on this call to get involved. I think this is a very exciting area of work. It's also one that really requires at this stage a lot of brain power and good committed people to make it work. Why? Because we have these challenges. Those, simply put, awareness raising and capacity development, very much what we're doing with this webinar. How do we ensure that free, prior, and informed consent, particularly of Indigenous peoples and local communities, is respected when governments or others are looking to identify and report OECMs? How do we measure the effectiveness? This whole framework hinges on being able to measure effectiveness. And how do we do that? And how do we do it, again, in a just way, particularly, again, when engaging Indigenous peoples and local communities and their traditional knowledge and ways of managing lands and seas. Other issues include issues relating to the legal mechanisms, what kinds of support are relevant, what kind of fundings may be available, and let's make sure that we're not taking from protected areas to fund OECMs. We'd like to see an expansion of that, the funding available. And of course, this all-important aspect of ensuring that we are verifying these areas as appropriate and reporting them properly as well. I'll end there. Thanks very much. Thank you, William.
Great, thank you very much, Harry. That was very helpful. Good to see the updates and introduction to the OECMs. I will mention to the participants that we have space later in the program for breakout group discussions and also time for discussion at the end of the program. So we'll hold any questions or anything from the audience until then and go ahead with the presentations. The next presentation is by me, so I'll just share my screen here. So I want to give a sort of overview about exactly sort of what we're talking about. So OECMs and landscape approaches. So what are we talking about with this? We have here a map created by IUCN, WCPA, and colleagues. These are all the protected areas that have been created in the world. Many of you may know that the previous plan for biodiversity under the Convention on Biological Diversity called for 17% of the world to be covered. And it's expected that there will be a goal for 30 by 30. So 30% of the world protected in some form by 2030. So all of these protected areas have been created in the world since, I believe, since 1872, when the first national park was created. And it's about 15% of the world at this point. So we have to double this amount in 8 years, according to the plan. So it's a bit of a challenge, I think. So protected areas obviously can cover quite a bit of that. And then some of the OECMs that have, or areas that have been presented as possible OECMs, sort of natural areas and unused areas, or supposedly unused areas. If they can get to 30%, that would be great. But it may be difficult to reach that amount just with very natural area, pristine sort of natural areas. So it's a challenge, but I think we should not despair. This is also a good opportunity for all of us. But with the recognition that it will probably be necessary, I think Harry mentioned this, hinted at this, that it's probably be necessary to include some areas that have a more of a higher degree of human influence than many protected areas have in order to reach 30%. But of course, as mentioned earlier, these have to be areas with very demonstrably good meaning sort of sustainable, long-term, equitable human nature relationships that most importantly result in biodiversity outcomes. So how is our crisis an opportunity? I'm sharing this Chinese character because I'm based in East Asia. And there's a sort of saying that goes around in English language circles sometimes, that the character for in Chinese for crisis is also the same character for opportunity. And we have this character that's read ki in Japanese here. And so how we're looking at how the crisis is an opportunity is that if we can make some areas with demonstrably good human nature relationships into OECMs that create biodiversity outcomes, then these can be good examples also for bringing together all areas into better harmony with nature, ecosystem integrity, and so on. And therefore contribute to the 30 by 30 goals and also contribute to biodiversity in the other 70% of the world. And one effective tool, well, I'll first say that unfortunately the JFK was mistaken in his statement that crisis and opportunity are the same in Chinese, and this character does not actually both mean crisis and opportunity, but I think it's a good metaphor anyway. And in our opportunity, we think that a landscape approach is one good tool for creating harmonious human nature relationships. So what are we talking about with the landscape approach in this context? Well, there's a lot of different definitions of sort of what a landscape approach is, and there's different approaches. So I'd just like to mention some key points, not a full definition in this case. But first of all, what is an approach to? An approach to area-based conservation in this case. The second point is that it means to consider the landscape as the unit. So that's why it's a landscape approach, rather than taking a species conservation or another kind of yardstick. The landscape is the basic unit of conservation. And also in any landscapes where humans exist, if they're going to be sustainable, humans are part of nature. So they're not sort of the owners of nature, they're part of the nature itself. So in that case, nature positive in this case means good for humans as well as good as for other living beings, because humans are part of nature. So the sort of landscapes that we're looking at in a lot of our work is a diverse landscape. And so just quickly go over why landscape diversity is a good thing and can help biodiversity. So sometimes a higher degree of, or some degree of human management can actually result in greater biodiversity. And why is that? Because it has more diverse set of habitats. So for example, if you have a forest that's allowed to grow into a tall forest, a certain amount of light can shine on the forest and get caught in the canopy, and a certain amount of light will get to the ground. And it's the same amount of light all throughout the forest. So some kinds of animals and plants will thrive in this, but there's other kinds that will not. But if you have a very diverse landscape with crops and scrublands and orchards and forests, then different amounts of light can hit the ground and hit the different kinds of plants, and you get different soil temperatures and so on. And then this will lead to a higher diversity of plants and animals that can thrive in each of these mini ecosystems. And you result in some cases in higher biodiversity. And this can happen naturally, but also we should note that humans can manage landscapes in this way to make this happen. The other question, of course, going back even one step further maybe, is what is a landscape? And we're talking about here about a landscape approach, meaning to work at multiple scales. So there may be very identifiable landscapes, like a landscape that is maybe a watershed or some sort of like one valley. And it may have various land uses in it. I should mention this example on the screen is something I just got off of Google Maps completely at random. So I don't know if it's a sustainable one, but if you look at this sort of valley, you can see there's different things going on in this watershed. And it has different land uses. So a very local scale landscape may be sustainable as a ecosystem on its own, but another local area may not be sustainable just in a very local sense, but in a larger context, in a larger mosaic of a larger landscape, it can be part of a sustainable system. So even a protected area may not create all the biodiversity that we hope for, but it can be integrated into the wider landscape and seascape, which is actually the language that you find in the biodiversity goals. So landscape, looking at different scales, you might have this landscape. I don't know if it's sustainable, but then you also need to consider that same landscape in a slightly wider, like a sub-national sort of level. And then also maybe at more of a national level and a regional level. And I don't know, eventually maybe you get to this level as the biggest landscape in the world. But we're talking about, so for OECMs, I think we're talking probably around the scale of sort of the same scale as we talk about protected areas. But also the point is that it's very important to consider that in multiple scales and have the right governance so it works as part of a landscape and also the wider landscape. And to do this on the ground, it's important that we consider the interests of all stakeholders in the landscape. So that means including culture and including economic and trade networks and the rights of stakeholders. This is a lot of the things that Harry mentioned earlier, including the disadvantaged sectors of society, and also community management practices, science, and all other factors. All of this whole thing is to make a holistic and complex view of the landscape is needed to make it truly sustainable for the world. So this all of this can help biodiversity when done correctly instead of forcing trade-offs. And I'm going a little bit long, but I just want to look at some of the places that have been considered for OECM designation already. I took this picture from the front of the IUCN report on OECMs and looked at this picture in particular. So the question here is not just whether nature is protected by itself, because that's important, but also if we're looking at a sustainable landscape approach to OECMs, then also we need other questions like, is culture respected? And are trade systems biodiversity friendly? Are people treated equally? And then ultimately you get to bigger questions like, is the whole landscape in harmony with nature? And will it provide biodiversity outcomes for the long term? And this is what we're talking about with the landscape approach to OECMs. And I hope that what you'll be discussing partly in the working groups today and in our discussion is what this means to how this is actually done on the ground. So that's basically the end of my presentation. I'd go ahead and introduce the next presentation, which is going to be given by Terence, Hay-Edie, and ClaraMatallana, who are both with the UNDP GEF Small Grants Program, working on something called the COMDEKS project. So go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks very much, William. So I will hopefully complement the last two speakers. So I'm a program advisor with the UNDP implemented GEF Small Grants Program and have been involved with the COMDEKS initiative since the early days when this partnership started in 2011. So just to echo the point that Harry was making about the year 2010, if we rewind the clock back to that important year when Japan was hosting the COP 10 in Nagoya, there was a meeting in Paris in UNESCO as it happens to scope out what models existed for socio-ecological production landscapes and seascapes, and a range of examples from different parts of the world, including in Europe around terroir and work being done by FAO on globally ingenious agricultural heritage systems and so on. Cultural landscapes of UNESCO were presented as different types of sepals. And then from that basically came a partnership between the UNDP and the government of Japan, UNU-IAS, and the institutions listed below to develop case studies to demonstrate what sepals are in action. So the Community Development and Knowledge Management Initiative for the Satayama Initiative has evolved over the last 10-year time frame with a focus on sepals in 20 countries, with use of small grants on the ground to not just document, but also strengthen these sepals. So the first two phases supported projects in 150 projects in 20 countries and had four main outcomes. So the strengthening of ecosystem services, we'll hear more about there'll be a breakout group on the production systems and value chains later on in this session, as well as livelihoods and incomes. But I would emphasize the right-hand column in terms of the governance institutions that Harry also mentioned. So one of the challenges with the COMDEKS work on these sepals was finding the right landscape scale governance. And so in some instances, there is strong traditional customary governance. In other cases, perhaps there is a need to bring that governance institution into being. And so this is something that was tested through the COMDEKS phase 1 and 2 across a whole range of different ecosystem types, ranging from grasslands in Mongolia, mountain ecosystems in Bhutan. Some of the colleagues are on the call from those countries, coastal seascapes in Turkey, inland water systems, and so on. And here you see on this slide some of those examples from really all parts of the world. So the experience from COMDEKS has been documented in a series of publications. One on the left is one of those summary overviews. And then another important part of COMDEKS was the use of a set of indicators of resilience developed initially through the International Society of Ethnobiology, later with Biodiversity International, which were picked up through the IPSI and the Satayama Initiative to be tested by COMDEKS on the ground. So this gives a snapshot of the types of challenges and the range of situations that sepals are confronted with. Now, before handing over to my colleague ClaraMatallana, I would just like to emphasize one very important report which was released in 2019, which is the global assessment of IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, for those of you that don't know the IPBES. And so in the context of this year, which is now reviewing the next set of targets, so that, similar to the 2010 period we were talking about, in order to move towards this, if the target 3 is approved on 30% by 2030, that's a lot of land area and sea area that would come under some form of protection or conservation. And so the subject of this webinar is really about the potential for OECMs to play a very large role in this target. And the reason I put this slide up from IPBES is that one of the key conclusions of this global assessment was that the best and most viable and equitable way of achieving those biodiversity targets would be through land sharing as opposed to land sparing. And this is a big debate. Not everyone agrees on this in the conservation world. But essentially, where you have this close and very intimate relationship to landscapes that have evolved historically over very long periods, in some cases through domestication of crops, through agrobiodiversity and so on, the potential is probably greater than trying to set aside more protected areas in the sense of the kind of classic empty of human habitation. So now I'd like to pass over to my colleague ClaraMatallana, who has been doing a review of the third phase of COMDEKS, which has focused in the last 2 years since 2019 on reviewing the range of financial sustainability options for sepals, as well as the policy and institutionalization options for sepals, and one of those is as OECMs. So in 10 countries, we've organized some dialogues to review the scope for sepals to be recognized as OECMs using the IUCN guidelines. So over to you, Clara. I can move the slides on if you just let me know.
Thank you very much, Terence. Good morning or afternoon to all of you. Thank you for being here with us. My name is ClaraMatallana. I'm from Colombia, and as Terence mentioned, I'm currently working as a consultant for COMDEKS 3, and I will be presenting some relationships between the OECM framework and the socio-ecological productive landscape approach. To start, I want to share this graph with you, depicting the possible relationship between OECMs and socio-ecological productive landscape. And I would like to highlight that even though the analysis should be done on a case-by-case basis in these areas, by definition, socio-ecological productive landscapes are areas where the interaction between people and the landscape maintains or enhances biodiversity while providing humans with the goods and services needed for their well-being, complying with the definition OECMs on delivering effective conservation regardless of their objective. Next slide. On the COMDEKS phases, countries have identified, as Terence mentioned, different types of socio-ecological productive landscapes, and these examples can give some clues on how to achieve the previously mentioned objectives. Here, for example, we have some sites that have some previous designation that recognize their biodiversity values, such as, for example, important bird areas in Fiji, key biodiversity areas in Turkey, a Ramsar site on Niger, another conservation area in El Salvador, and socio-ecological productive landscapes allows to recover traditional knowledge and practices to combine them with more recent concepts and approach to revitalize the landscapes and communities. Next. Other countries, for example, from the 10 that we have been analyzing, work on a larger scale, such as biological corridors in Ecuador and Costa Rica. You can see here the graphs of these corridors that are very big areas. And even though they have a top-down approach because these areas are proposed by a governmental authority, are defined as key territories that provides connectivity between protected areas and allow to promote innovative ways for sustainable development with the participation of the different types of stakeholders on a shared governance structure. In Ecuador, for example, corridors are known as bio-enterprise networks. Next. There are also other sites that correspond to more traditional definition of landscapes. And for example, these areas in Ghana and Mongolia, and also in Cambodia and Bhutan, consider more natural limits that allows to involve more local communities in effectively decision-making processes. For the landscape management, having also the support of regional and local authorities. Next. So there are some key issues to consider in this process of considering socio-ecological productive landscape as OECMs. Some of these countries have already applied the OECM criteria in these socio-ecological landscapes, and there are some key issues to consider. For example, on these areas, governance is a key aspect and in general is strengthened through effective collaborative management schemes. Also, livelihood of inhabitants is equally important than biodiversity conservation, looking for a balance between the two. Biodiversity values are also a key aspect and in some areas may require more research and capacity building to measure it. Some issues that are supported by COMDEKS, such as the strengthening on knowledge management, financial sustainability, institutionalizations and policy frameworks may give some important effects on long-term permanence of disease. Also, the existing indicators that Terence mentioned already gave sufficient information on some of the OECM's criteria. Next. To finish, some challenges and other considerations. Socio-ecological productive landscapes could be key for the post-2020 biodiversity framework goals, and the recognition provide a good opportunity to expand conservation of the heritage under a variety of governance and management regimes. And the approach gives some powerful insights on the real possibilities to have landscape where productive land uses and biodiversity coexist. But of course, there are some issues to take into account, such as that they are very different in size and composition. We see the different types of landscapes that we can have. Some are areas, some are mosaics that will require a case-by-case analysis. Other issue to consider is that zoning could be a key aspect to evaluate because some areas include urban areas or intensive land uses that may not be included on the OECM definition. Also, it's important to say that OECM is a new framework or concept to many people, so that requires a capacity building for interpretation and implementation, taking into account the context of each country. Also, it's important to consider that some of these areas are also being considering under other nominations such as UNESCO World Heritage Sites or ICAS, and that could be very confusing for local communities. And at the end, of course, for ensuring effective conservation, OECM's approach explore deeper high values conservation assets that may need extra formal measure in these areas. So thank you very much, and I hope some of these insights will be helpful for the group work. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much, Terence and Clara. Those are some good points about OECMs, and also it's nice that they're rooted in sort of on the ground cases that we can actually see examples. So the next step in this dialogue is we're going to break into breakout rooms. I'll just briefly mention there are going to be 3 breakout rooms. Each room has a facilitator and a note taker, at least one note taker, on various topics. I'll mention that we are going to divide everyone into breakout rooms at random. So I hope that with the hope that that will spark some people to have some new ideas and also bring be exposed to some newer ideas that other than what you might usually be. If you do feel very strongly, I guess you can send a message to somebody and we might be able to move you around a little bit, but please note that'll take a little time. And also it may take a little time as we get everybody settled into the different meeting groups and everyone in the right place. But so please bear with us, and we should have some great discussions. So Phil, I think we can go ahead with that, and fingers crossed it'll work out. Okay, so welcome back everybody to plenary. I hope your discussion wasn't cut off too abruptly. Someone was mid-sentence in our group, but I think we got most of our points and we had a very good discussion. For the facilitating the final session, which is a wrap up and a little bit of question and answer if possible, I'd like to introduce my colleague, longtime colleague, Suneetha Subramanian, who's a researcher at UNU-IAS. So Suneetha.
Thanks, William. Yes, we were all cut off abruptly. It was just not enough time. But we just started getting warmed up with the session I was in, and I do think there's a lot that's coming out, and the topics chosen are very, very pertinent, but at the same time require a lot more careful thought. So yeah, in the time we have remaining, maybe I'll invite the facilitators to first give a very quick and brief highlight of how your discussions went, and then we could take a few questions from across. So I'm going to request Ivana first, followed by Nina, and then Akane, if that's okay. That's how I see you all on my screen. Yeah, Ivana.
Thank you very much. So I was moderating the trade and supply chain issues for biodiversity positive OECMs, right? First of all, I apologize for my group participants because I was in the middle of a sentence when we went sent back to the plenary, but it's all good. We were finishing. So I will be brief. So we had one question about so communities incentives. So what kinds of incentives and advantages would you hope to receive for long-term biodiversity positive management, right? In terms of trade benefits or otherwise. So the main ideas that we shared are access to market access, right? Access to markets, to education, access to education on biodiversity-oriented production, market and trade, training for possible products that are eco-friendly, and capacity building. So a lot of, yeah, basically the main ideas shared were about access to markets and training, capacity building. We also said that before starting production, it's important that that access to preferential markets and the supply chain are established. Then we had the second question on ensuring equity. That is, for biodiversity positive management to be considered sustainable, it must also be equitable. So what can be done to ensure that landscape is not being exploited, right, in a consumer-producer relationship through trade with urban areas or others? And here we had popular idea that is empower community leadership, also ensuring transparency, and very important that OECM governance mechanism and decision-making processes have to be clear, equitable, and take into account the local people that are the ones that know how much to produce and for which purposes and benefits. I think that's all from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivana. Great. Nina, I'm not going to take any questions now. So we finished this round of highlighting and then we take questions. Nina?
Okay, thank you. So I facilitated the community engagement and participation session. We had a lively discussion. We were looking at trying to determine what are some of the best practices for ensuring that communities, local residents are fully engaged so that the long-term conservation goals are achieved. And it came out very, very clearly that we want to avoid the situation where these areas are regarded as future protected areas and that people's views are not considered and that there are different, it may be complex systems with different systems that need to be recognized. So what really came out is that the situation on the ground, the rights of the people who are living in these areas are all important. There's really no way to move ahead without ensuring that it's a rights-based approach to engaging with the communities, to getting their views, to understanding their governance systems and their systems. And also very important is to ensure that they understand what the benefits are and how they're going to benefit from it, and they should be benefiting from these areas. That was voiced by many of the participants. These areas are absolutely essential for recognizing the good practices of the people who live in these areas and focusing on ensuring that they are benefiting from them. There were some other points made about the importance of youth in participating. Intergenerational approaches are very, very important. And it was also made, the point made by many of the participants that there are a lot of good examples of best practices. There's a lot of work that's been done already on indicators and case studies, and we need to go to those and tap them. And there are also many case studies of protected areas, but then we can look at the areas outside to see where we can benefit and pull some of the protocols and best practices that are going to be important in making sure that these areas are successful. And there was also importance of capacity building was mentioned as well. So yeah, I think that was good. It was a great discussion, and I want to thank all the participants for their very good points.
Thank you, Nina. Akane?
Yes, thank you, Suneetha. Yes, so our group focused on cultural aspects of OECM designation and management. And I want to say that we really had a diverse group. We had a pretty rich diversity in terms of nationalities. We had people from all over the world, from Mauritius, Belize, Bhutan, and Colombia. And also we had people from different backgrounds, including youth and NGOs, actually from indigenous communities, and also there's a person from the company. So we had very diverse perspectives, but unfortunately we didn't have enough time to go in depth, but still we had a very interesting discussion. So just try to summarize a little bit. So we tried to consider what the role of what the culture actually plays in the OECM management, and also how it could be better or more adequately reflected in the policy processes. And also, we also try to go further to think of potential indicators to help incorporating these cultural aspects into the policy discussion. So just to pick up some points, so first of all, this OECM concept is still new for some of the, especially for at the local level. So there's also some skepticism. And so it was kind of stressed that it's important to really reflect the view of just to, yes, reflect the view of the local communities, what they see their places, and also to respect, because many indigenous and local communities, they have a special relationship with nature and worldviews. So really, we have to really understand, it's not just outside people are discussing, but just to also respect the decision by the local community. So that's really important. And also from the corporate perspectives, it was also pointed out that it's important to engage the wide range of stakeholders from the very beginning. So that's one of the points which was highlighted. And also another point, it's again, it's also we have to be rather flexible, and OECM just it has to be treated case by case, and also by country. So we still have to see, given that OECMs are quite diverse, so it's really important to we have this flexible approach. And finally, also capacity building was also highlighted in our breakout session as well. So yes, it's really important to have capacity building, and including the more technical, practical sense, to provide information also in local languages, so that they're also aware at the local level. And yes, and also the participants from Bhutan, he also indicated that it's rural migration and also social changes really affecting the management of OECMs. So in a sense that because they are the knowledge holder and custodian of those knowledges. So one of the indicators actually proposed during the breakout session was to maybe we could think of the number of people who inherited these cultural and spiritual values. So in this is just an example, but it's really important to consider cultural aspects in further discussion on this OECM. So thank you very much, and I hope I didn't miss anything else.
No, thank you, Akane. I'm afraid we're running, we're actually a little bit over time. So I don't think we'll have, okay. I see Eiji-san, you have your hand up. I'll probably just take this one question from Eiji-san and then do a very quick wrap up, and hopefully we will have an opportunity to continue this discussion through some kind of a forum, and William can advise us on that later. Eiji-san.
Okay. Thank you, Suneetha, and thank you the facilitators for your feedback. I have one comment on today's theme. As you may know, IUCN's OECM's guidelines say commercial purpose forestry and fisheries should be reported under Aichi Biodiversity Target 7, not as OECMs. I think it's a matter of interpretation of commercial purpose, and sustainably managed production landscapes should be reported as OECMs. But how can we register production landscapes as OECMs despite of the guidelines? Maybe we should have some answers to that question. And if you have a good answer, please let us know. Thank you.
Thank you, Eiji-san. Actually, this is a question that keeps recurring in all our discussions, I think. Okay, is this, Maria, is this a direct response to Eiji-san's question?
Yes, or maybe adding more confusion to it.
All right, very, very quickly, yeah, because William's going to start giving me dirty looks now. So, yeah, very quickly.
We have in Colombia some ethnic territories inhabited by Afro-Colombian descendants from the African slaves that were brought to the country by the Spanish conquerors. These territories are autonomous to a certain state, and they have the potential to become OECMs very fast. One of the livelihoods that they have, or one of the productive activities that they have is fishing, but it is not fisheries, it is artisanal fishing, and their surplus. In some periods of the year, they have a surplus. They also merchandise this. For example, in Bogota, there is a very good chain of restaurants that buys the fish that they fish directly from them. So they have a good supply, a good demand of their product, and they get preferential prices. If we were not to include fishing, not fisheries, but fishing as one of the productive ideas, issues in the OECM, we wouldn't be able to identify or let them identify themselves as contributing to conservation. So it depends on what the people are doing. If we have a bottom-up focus on the establishment and management of these areas, but also on their cultural background to see what productive activities and how they are managing them.
Thank you, Maria. Very, very valid points. I mean, I think it's been a recurrent theme in all of the discussions, because what I heard, and I'm going to very quickly summarize what I heard, is when we are speaking about, and especially from a landscape context, it is really a socio-ecological system, right? And we should never forget that it's an interplay between the two that's contributing to conservation, to human well-being. There's all of these needs that are there on either side, if you want to call it, but as a system, it operates together, and it has to work in a harmonious manner. Now, when we start talking about OECM's designation, and this is a point that came in the group that discussed on culture, when we start talking about designating places that have been occupied and actively worked on by local communities or indigenous peoples, or any sets of groups of people who are engaging in activities that contribute to conservation, but are definitely linked to a productive use, right? It becomes a matter of the interest to designate a place as OECMs pretty much comes as top down, because it's an interest from the planners to find, to identify areas that we can classify as conservation areas that are important for for biodiversity, important for conservation. For the local people over there, for the local communities, it's overlaying something that is already of some priority for them. Either it's a priority for them, either in a cultural aspect, it's a priority for them as a livelihood aspect, it's a priority for them in terms of a social aspect. So it's and various such values that they hold, right? So when we start looking, if we look at it closely, then it becomes a negotiation between what we want as planners, as policy goals to be achieved, versus what the priorities on the ground are. And that context has to be better nuanced when we do these exercises. And that's the point, I think, also that came about, that we need to make it much more easier for people to understand what is it that we are trying to do and how they contribute to what it is that we are trying to do. So it's about better communication, raising awareness, more peer learning exchanges between communities, between these decision makers on the ground. And it's not necessarily just the local communities, but it's also just, various levels of formal governance that is operational on the ground who have an impact on what is being taken, the decisions being taken on the ground. And that's something that also has to be reflected in more appropriate capacity development interventions. So it's encouraging to see that even in the policy space, that we are moving away from the more external expert-driven capacity development type activities like workshops and all of that to more decentralized capacity building activities. So it's encouraging to see all of that happening. But I think by having just this discussion, about 60, 70 minutes that we had here has thrown up so many issues which help us to see better the confusions that are out there, the challenges that are out there, but at the same time, the opportunities that are out there for us to actually go and make a difference at the local level. There is a lot of things that are happening on the ground, but to actually raise that to inform policy making. And I think, therefore, we need to keep this conversation going so we actually learn more lessons. We can, how shall I say, curate these various lessons that we have across all of us who are present here and our various networks with which we interact to try and see how we can make this a much more dynamic and lively enterprise, so to say, than like to just have a fixed concept and try to fit something there into activities that are happening on the ground. I'll stop there now, William, over to you. Sorry, we are 10 minutes over.
Yes, great. Thanks, Suneetha, and thanks everyone. Thanks for staying a few minutes extra. I won't keep you much more. Just to say that this meeting has been, I found it very, very great and very wonderful. Thanks to all of your help. And this is the first step in sort of a new joint project between Conservation International and UNU-IAS. And we look forward to hopefully organizing more of these similar types of events, and we'll keep this dialogue going up through the GBF and beyond, and hopefully contributing to biodiversity, OECMs in particular, and biodiversity on the ground in the world for real. We will be in touch with a post-event survey, and you can get back to us. And if there's anything you didn't get to say today, you'll have a chance to say it then, and we hope you'll keep in touch. So thanks very much to all my co-organizers, cooperating organizations, the facilitators, speakers, and of course, not last but not least, all the participants. Thank you very much for your participation, and we'll be in touch. So that's the end. Thank you.